The discovery of the arrowhead, a piece of ancient history embedded in a modern tragedy, was the first domino to fall. It shattered the neatly constructed narrative of a simple, if tragic, accident. The question of how a primitive projectile could strike a pilot in a high-tech fighter jet became the central, baffling question of the investigation. The initial assumption that the arrowhead was a bizarre coincidence was quickly discarded. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The arrowhead had struck the pilot. But how? The answer, it turned out, was not in the sky, but on the ground. The investigators, now with a new and unsettling focus, began to re-examine every piece of evidence. They revisited the crash site, this time not looking for wreckage, but for any sign of human activity, any strange artifact that might have been overlooked in the initial survey. The arrowhead, it turned out, was not alone. Near the original crash site, a few meters away from where the pilot's remains were found, the search team uncovered another strange piece of evidence. It was a small, rusted metal sphere no bigger than a golf ball. It was a bizarre, unidentifiable object, and for a moment, the investigators were at a loss. But one of the team members, an expert in Cold War-era technology, recognized it. It was a remnant of a tracking device, an early, crude form of a radio transponder. These devices, known as beacons, were sometimes used for training exercises to track objects or other aircraft from the ground. They were primitive, yes, but they were a part of the technological landscape of the 1950s. The presence of the transponder, an object that had no business being in a remote, unmonitored part of the forest, was a new and troubling piece of the puzzle. It suggested that a training exercise had been taking place in the area at the time of the crash. But what kind of exercise? And what was the connection to the arrowhead? The investigators, in a moment of inspired speculation, began to piece together a new, horrific theory. The military, in the 1950s, was known for its unconventional training methods. One of those methods, it was whispered, involved testing the ability of pilots to evade ground-based radar. The transponder, it was now theorized, was not from a training exercise in the traditional sense. It was part of a bait system, a device designed to attract the attention of a target. The arrowhead, with its crude but very real lethality, was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It was now believed that the arrowhead was not a projectile in the traditional sense. It is not shot from a bow. It was instead a component of a booby trap, a bizarre and terrifying device designed to test a pilot's reflexes and skill. But why? The investigators, digging deeper into the old military records, uncovered a new and chilling detail. The Air Force, in the 1950s, was engaged in a secret, highly classified project. The project was codenamed Project Arrow. Its purpose, as revealed in the declassified documents, was to test the effectiveness of new anti-aircraft systems. The tests, however, were not conducted with missiles. They were conducted with something far more sinister: ground-based launchers that fire high-speed projectiles at high-flying targets. The projectiles, the document stated, were not conventional bullets or missiles. They were a new, experimental form of projectile designed to be untraceable by radar. The shape, it was noted, was conical with a feathered shaft, the very shape of the arrowhead. The truth was now coming into a terrible, sharp focus. Captain Jarnot, on his solo navigation mission, had flown into a secret, unmonitored test zone. He was not the target, but a victim of a terrible and tragic accident. The booby trap, a crude device designed to fire the arrowheads at passing aircraft, had malfunctioned. It had not been a missile that struck the plane, but a simple, almost primitive projectile fired with lethal force. The arrowhead had penetrated the cockpit, struck the pilot, and caused him to lose control of the aircraft. In that split second, the pilot was incapacitated, and the plane, a high-speed metal bird, began its final, uncontrolled spiral to the ground. The plane, it was now believed, had not exploded in midair. It had been torn apart by the immense forces of the uncontrolled, supersonic descent. The scattering of the wreckage, the twisted metal, and the absolute destruction of the aircraft were all consistent with a high-speed, uncontrolled dive. The revelation was profound and horrifying. The military had not simply lost a pilot. They had, in a terrible and tragic irony, been responsible for his death. The truth was far more sinister than a simple accident. It was a secret, a cover-up, a buried history that had been waiting for half a century to be unearthed. The Jarnot family, who had long believed their husband and father was lost in a terrible accident, was now faced with a new and more painful reality. He was a victim, not of the wilderness, but of his own government. The silence of the forest was not the silence of an indifferent nature. It was the silence of a deep, dark secret, a truth buried under layers of secrecy and time, a truth that was finally being brought into the light, and with it a new and profound sense of grief and injustice. It was a Tuesday morning in late September 1956, and the sky above the Bavarian forest was a crisp, perfect canvas of cloudless blue. For Captain Joseph Jarnot, a 30-year-old F-86 Sabre pilot stationed at the U.S. Air Force Base in Germany, it was a routine flight. He was scheduled for a solo navigation training mission, a simple 3-hour flight over the dense, rolling landscape that had become his temporary home. He took off at 10:14 a.m. His last transmission, a clear, confident voice confirming his position, came at 11:32 a.m. And then there was nothing. A sudden, absolute silence fell over the radio waves, a vacuum where a man's voice had just been. Back on the base, the control tower watched the minute hand tick forward, their initial calm giving way to a gnawing unease. The routine had been broken. An hour passed. Then two. The silence stretched from a peculiar anomaly into a terrifying certainty. Captain Jarnot and his F-86, serial number 51 to 13,115, had vanished. The first search parties were scrambled almost immediately. Their initial task was a near impossible one, to locate a silver needle in a green haystack. The Bavarian forest, known locally as the Bayerischer Wald, was an ancient, sprawling wilderness of towering pines and deep valleys. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, but also of unforgiving terrain. Helicopters crisscrossed the grid, their rotors a frantic buzz against the quiet, indifferent landscape. On the ground, soldiers and local police moved in tight, disciplined lines, their eyes scanning every shadow, every thicket. The families of the airmen stationed there knew the grim calculus of these situations. They understood that the longer the silence, the more likely the outcome was tragic. And for Joe Jarnot's wife, Anna, who was back in the States, the news came as a single, devastating phone call. It was a moment that divided her life into two distinct parts. The before, filled with the promise of his return, and the after, dominated by an agonizing void. The initial investigation proceeded with a grim, mechanical efficiency. The last known position of the aircraft was pinpointed, a rough circle drawn on a map. Within this circle, the search intensified. The authorities considered every possibility, from mechanical failure to pilot error, and even the slim, chilling chance of defection, a whisper that was quickly dismissed. This was a pilot with a stellar record, a man devoted to his wife and his country. The notion was absurd. The search continued for weeks. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into a month, then two. The leaves on the trees, once a vibrant green, turned to hues of rust and gold, and then fell, leaving the forest floor a carpet of decay. The early snows of the Bavarian winter began to blanket the landscape, burying any potential sign of the crash. The operation, once a massive, coordinated effort, began to shrink. The helicopters were grounded. The search teams were recalled. The authorities, with a heavy heart, were forced to conclude the unthinkable. Captain Joseph Jarnot and his jet had been lost forever, swallowed whole by the vast, unforgiving forest. His name was added to the somber list of those missing in action. For the Jarnot family, the years that followed were a slow, unending procession of grief. Anna held on to the hope, the desperate, fragile hope, that her husband might still be alive, that he had somehow survived the crash and was wandering, lost, waiting to be found. But hope, unmoored from any evidence, is a cruel anchor. His son, Joe Jr., grew up with a ghost as a father, a face in a photograph, a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and sadness. The mystery of the missing pilot became a family legend, a dark footnote in their history. The military files were closed, marked with a final, heartbreaking designation, presumed dead. The case was a cold one, colder than the winter winds that swept through the Bavarian pines, and for a half-century, it remained frozen in time, an unsolved riddle left to the whispering trees. The aircraft, a marvel of mid-century engineering, had simply ceased to exist, a victim of an unknown catastrophe in a remote corner of the world. Time, the ultimate solvent, began to wash away the memory of the event for all but those closest to it. The initial dramatic urgency faded into the quiet hum of history, and the story of Captain Jarnot became just one of many forgotten tales from the Cold War era, a ghost story for pilots flying over the same airspace. But the forest, which had guarded its secret for so long, was about to be forced to give it up. The silence was about to be broken. 50 years passed. The year was 2006. The Cold War had long since ended, and the political landscape of Europe had been redrawn. The Bavarian forest, once a military training ground, was now a protected national park, a haven for hikers and nature lovers. For half a century, the wilderness had held a terrible secret, a secret buried under layers of pine needles, leaves, and time itself. The search for Captain Jarnot had long been forgotten by most, relegated to a footnote in military history. But for his family, the wound remained open, a scar that never fully healed. Joe Jr., now a man in his 50s, had spent his life haunted by the ghost of his father. The official record offered no closure, no finality, only a frustrating lack of answers. He had held onto the belief that one day, some piece of evidence would surface, a small glimmer of truth in the darkness. That glimmer came not from an official search, but from a most improbable of sources, a civilian. In August of 2006, a German man named Peter Hien, a dedicated amateur archaeologist and metal detectorist, was granted permission to search a remote section of the forest. He wasn't looking for a lost pilot. He was searching for ancient Roman artifacts, the remnants of a past millennia. His metal detector, a high-tech modern marvel, hummed and beeped, a stark contrast to the silence of the ancient woods. He had been sweeping the area for hours when the device emitted a loud, distinct tone, signaling a large metallic object buried beneath the earth. He began to dig. The soil was thick with roots and packed hard by decades of undisturbed growth. He cleared away the topsoil, and then a faint glint of rusted metal caught his eye. It was a shard of aluminum, misshapen but unmistakably man-made. He dug deeper, his curiosity piqued. More pieces of metal emerged, fragments of a fuselage, scattered like a jigsaw puzzle in the dirt. It wasn't Roman. It wasn't ancient. It was a modern, industrial ruin. A few more shovels of dirt, and he uncovered something that sent a jolt of recognition and dread through him. It was a section of a wing, still painted with the faded but clear markings of the U.S. Air Force. This was a crash site. Peter Hien, a man accustomed to the slow pace of historical discovery, had stumbled upon a scene of sudden, violent destruction. He immediately contacted the authorities. The local police, initially skeptical, dispatched a team to the remote location. When they arrived, they were faced with a scene of utter devastation. The wreckage was not a single, recognizable piece of an aircraft. It was an intricate, chaotic collage of twisted metal, shattered instruments, and unidentifiable debris scattered over a wide area. It was as if the plane had not crashed, but exploded in mid-air, a violent unraveling in the sky. The initial assumption, the one that had held for 50 years, was that the plane had simply flown into the ground. But the evidence now suggested something far more complex and terrifying. The wreckage was spread out, not concentrated in a single impact zone. The discovery of the crash site was the first and most crucial piece of evidence in a new, unspooling investigation. It was a moment of profound revelation, a brutal end to half a century of uncertainty. But the most important discovery was yet to come. As the investigators meticulously cataloged the wreckage, they began to uncover more personal, more heartbreaking details. A flight helmet, its leather and plastic brittle with age, lay half-buried in the soil. A small, tarnished medallion with the image of a saint on it was found, tangled in a wire. And then, a small piece of metal, no bigger than a finger, was found a few feet from what was identified as the cockpit. It was the serial number plate from the jet's tail fin, rusted and pitted, but its numbers still legible. The plate confirmed the grim truth. This was the F-86 Sabre, serial number 51 to 13,115, the one that had vanished in 1956. The news reached the Jarnot family like a lightning strike. The ghost had a face, a place, a story. Joe Jr. and his mother, Anna, now an elderly woman, finally had a destination for their grief. The search had begun anew, but this time, the stakes were different. It was no longer a rescue mission. It was a quest for an explanation, for a final, terrible truth. The discovery of the wreckage shattered the comfortable, simple narrative of a plane lost to the wilderness. The mystery had deepened. What had caused this violent, catastrophic event? And where was the pilot? The final piece of the puzzle, the most vital and heartbreaking one, was still missing. The forest had given up its secret, but only in part. It had revealed the plane, but it still held the man. And so, the investigation shifted from the wreckage to the most crucial and tragic piece of the puzzle. The search for Captain Joseph Jarnot, which had been frozen in time for 50 years, was now alive again, a desperate race against the clock of history, to find the final resting place of a man who had vanished in a cloudless sky so long ago. The trees, silent witnesses for half a century, held the key to the final, haunting question: what happened in those final moments and why? The discovery of the crash site was a beginning, not an end. It was the first act of a new, darker drama. The authorities, along with military investigators, descended upon the remote Bavarian clearing. The forest floor, which had for so long been a quiet, undisturbed blanket of pine needles and moss, was now a crime scene. The wreckage was cataloged, photographed, and carefully removed. Every piece, no matter how small, was a clue, a fragment of a story waiting to be told. The initial forensic analysis of the debris confirmed the fears of the investigators. The crash was not a simple mechanical failure. The extensive scattering of the wreckage, the twisted and mangled state of the fuselage, and the sheer violence of the scene suggested a catastrophic structural failure, possibly a mid-air explosion. This theory was terrifying. Had the plane been shot down? Had a forgotten piece of Cold War history just been unearthed in the tranquil German woods? The investigators considered every possibility, poring over old flight logs and intelligence reports from the 1950s. The political climate of the era was tense, but the notion of a U.S. jet being shot down over Allied territory was almost unthinkable. And if it was an enemy missile, where was the evidence of an attack? There was none. The initial theory, that of a mid-air explosion, gave way to a more detailed and chilling possibility. The F-86 Sabre, a sleek and fast jet for its time, was a pressurized aircraft. A sudden loss of cabin pressure at high altitude could cause a pilot to lose consciousness. The investigators examined the wreckage for any sign of a catastrophic pressurization failure, but the evidence was inconclusive. The focus then shifted to the pilot. If the plane had disintegrated, what happened to Captain Jarnot? The search for his remains became the top priority. A new search team, this time with modern equipment and a grim focus, was dispatched. They worked in tight, disciplined lines, expanding their search area outward from the primary wreckage site. The hope, fragile as it was to find a single, definitive piece of evidence that could explain the pilot's final moments. The search led them to a small, hidden gully, a shallow depression in the forest floor, a few hundred meters from the main crash site. It was here, partially buried under a thick layer of wet leaves and soil, that they made the most profound and heartbreaking discovery. A helmet, its leather brittle and its paint faded, was found. Beside it, a set of human remains. The discovery was met with a somber silence. The long-lost pilot had finally been found. His remains were carefully and reverently removed and transported to a forensic lab for examination. The analysis, which took weeks, would provide the final, devastating chapter to the story. The forensic pathologists examined the bones and the remnants of the flight suit. The results were conclusive. These were the remains of Captain Joseph Jarnot. The physical evidence provided new clues to his final moments. The body showed signs of a sudden, violent deceleration, consistent with a high-altitude impact. But there was something else, a small, almost insignificant detail that would change the entire narrative. Tangled in the remnants of his flight suit, near the shoulder area, was a small, rusted piece of metal. It was not a part of the plane. It was a small, conical piece of iron with a sharp, pointed end. It was an arrowhead. The discovery of the arrowhead was a complete and utter anomaly. It was a bizarre, jarring detail that did not fit with the timeline or the technology of the 1950s. The investigators were baffled. Was this a historical artifact that had simply been in the area? A relic from a forgotten past that had somehow become tangled with the pilot's remains? The initial reaction was to dismiss it as a coincidence, a piece of ancient history found in a modern tragedy. But the forensic evidence told a different, more chilling story. The arrowhead was found lodged in the pilot's shoulder, and a microscopic analysis revealed that the pilot's bone showed a small, almost imperceptible nick. It was a wound, not from the crash, but from the impact of the arrowhead. The arrowhead, small and rusted as it was, had been a projectile. It had struck the pilot with considerable force. The forensic pathologist, a man accustomed to the cold, hard truths of scientific evidence, delivered a conclusion that was both shocking and simple. The arrowhead was a part of the cause of death. But how? How could a man flying a state-of-the-art jet at high altitude be struck by a primitive, rusted projectile? The mystery had just deepened, twisting from simple accident into a bizarre and unsettling riddle. The truth, it seemed, was more complex and terrifying than anyone had ever imagined. The investigation, which had seemed to be at its end, had just begun anew, a new line of inquiry that would lead investigators down a strange and unexpected path to an object that defied all logic and shattered every assumption they had made. The truth, it turned out, was not found in the wreckage, but in a small, ancient relic that held the key to a modern tragedy. The discovery of the arrowhead, a piece of ancient history embedded in a modern tragedy, was the first domino to fall. It shattered the neatly constructed narrative of a simple, if tragic, accident. The question of how a primitive projectile could strike a pilot in a high-tech fighter jet became the central, baffling question of the investigation. The initial assumption that the arrowhead was a bizarre coincidence was quickly discarded. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The arrowhead had struck the pilot. But how? The answer, it turned out, was not in the sky, but on the ground. The investigators, now with a new and unsettling focus, began to re-examine every piece of evidence. They revisited the crash site, this time not looking for wreckage, but for any sign of human activity, any strange artifact that might have been overlooked in the initial survey. The arrowhead, it turned out, was not alone. Near the original crash site, a few meters away from where the pilot's remains were found, the search team uncovered another strange piece of evidence. It was a small, rusted metal sphere, no bigger than a golf ball. It was a bizarre, unidentifiable object, and for a moment, the investigators were at a loss. But one of the team members, an expert in Cold War-era technology, recognized it. It was a remnant of a tracking device, an early, crude form of a radio transponder. These devices, known as beacons, were sometimes used for training exercises to track objects or other aircraft from the ground. They were primitive, yes, but they were a part of the technological landscape of the 1950s. The presence of the transponder, an object that had no business being in a remote, unmonitored part of the forest, was a new and troubling piece of the puzzle. It suggested that a training exercise had been taking place in the area at the time of the crash. But what kind of exercise? And what was the connection to the arrowhead? The investigators, in a moment of inspired speculation, began to piece together a new, horrific theory. The military in the 1950s was known for its unconventional training methods. One of those methods, it was whispered, involved testing the ability of pilots to evade ground-based radar. The Air Force in the 1950s was engaged in a secret, highly classified project. The project was codenamed Project Arrow. Its purpose, as revealed in the declassified documents, was to test the effectiveness of new anti-aircraft systems. The tests, however, were not conducted with missiles. They were conducted with something far more sinister: ground-based launchers that fired high-speed projectiles at high-flying targets. The projectiles, the document stated, were not conventional bullets or missiles. They were a new, experimental form of projectile, designed to be untraceable by radar. The shape, it was noted, was conical with a feathered shaft, the very shape of the arrowhead. The truth was now coming into a terrible, sharp focus. Captain Jarnot, on his solo navigation mission, had flown into a secret, unmonitored test zone. He was not the target, but a victim of a terrible and tragic accident. The booby trap, a crude device designed to fire the arrowheads at passing aircraft, had malfunctioned. It had not been a missile that struck the plane, but a simple, almost primitive projectile fired with lethal force. The arrowhead had penetrated the cockpit, struck the pilot, and caused him to lose control of the aircraft. In that split second, the pilot was incapacitated, and the plane, a high-speed metal bird, began its final, uncontrolled spiral to the ground. The plane, it was now believed, had not exploded in midair. It had been torn apart by the immense forces of the uncontrolled, supersonic descent. The scattering of the wreckage, the twisted metal, and the absolute destruction of the aircraft were all consistent with a high-speed, uncontrolled dive. The revelation was profound and horrifying. The military had not simply lost a pilot. They had, in a terrible and tragic irony, been responsible for his death. The truth was far more sinister than a simple accident. It was a secret, a cover-up, a buried history that had been waiting for half a century to be unearthed. The Jarnot family, who had long believed their husband and father was lost in a terrible accident, was now faced with a new and more painful reality. He was a victim, not of the wilderness, but of his own government. The silence of the forest was not the silence of an indifferent nature. It was the silence of a deep, dark secret, a truth buried under layers of secrecy and time, a truth that was finally being brought into the light, and with it a new and profound sense of grief and injustice. The revelation of Project Arrow and the chilling circumstances of Captain Jarnot's death transformed the narrative from a mystery into a profound injustice. The focus of the investigation, now a joint effort between military and civilian authorities, shifted from a search for a body to a quest for a definitive truth, a final accounting of a long-buried secret. The Jarnot family, for so long a source of quiet sorrow, now became a force for a new kind of justice. Joe Jr., armed with the findings of the investigation, began a relentless campaign to force the military to declassify the full details of Project Arrow and to acknowledge the tragic circumstances of his father's death. The military, initially reluctant and guarded, was eventually forced to respond. The evidence, unearthed from the silent forest, was now too compelling to ignore. The presence of the arrowhead, the transponder, and the detailed forensic analysis of the pilots remains all pointed to a single, terrible conclusion. A man had been killed not by enemy fire, but by a tragic and preventable accident during a top-secret training exercise. The official narrative, the one that had held for 50 years, was shattered. The final report, a document that had been buried in the archives for decades, was finally declassified. It revealed a shocking degree of bureaucratic negligence and a casual disregard for human life. The report confirmed that Captain Jarnot had, indeed, flown into an unmonitored and improperly secured test zone. The booby trap, as it was now called, was a new, experimental prototype designed to fire projectiles at high-speed targets. The report stated that the device had malfunctioned, firing at a target it was not intended to engage. The pilot, it concluded, was not the intended victim, but a tragic collateral casualty of a reckless and poorly executed military experiment. The report was a devastating admission, a final, unsparing account of a terrible truth. For the Jarnot family, the report was a final, painful piece of closure, a definitive answer to a half-century of questions. The ghost of a father and husband, a figure in a photograph, was now a man with a story, a victim of a secret military program. His death was no longer a mystery. It was a crime. The discovery of the wreckage and the subsequent investigation not only brought an end to a family's search, but also forced a re-examination of a forgotten chapter of military history. It shed light on the often ruthless nature of the Cold War, a time when secret projects and technological advancements were pursued with a single-minded intensity, often with little regard for the collateral damage. The story of Captain Jarnot, once a somber footnote, now became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the human cost of scientific and military ambition. The Bavarian forest, which had held its secret for so long, had finally surrendered its truth. The rusted wreckage and the final remains of a man lost in time were the keys that unlocked a dark, buried history. The forest, a silent witness for 50 years, was no longer just a place of peaceful beauty. It was a grave, a memorial, and a somber testament to a man who, in the pursuit of his duty, became a victim of a terrible and tragic secret. The final chapter of the story was written not with a pen, but with a metal detector, a shovel, and the relentless determination of a son who refused to let his father be forgotten. The narrative of Captain Jarnot's disappearance had come full circle from a simple accident to a tragic, documented act of injustice. The silence that fell over the radio waves on that crisp September morning in 1956 had finally been broken, replaced by a terrible and unsparing truth. The final, heartbreaking postscript to Captain Jarnot's story came months after the official reports were filed and the final accounting was made. The military, in an act of solemn recognition, finally offered to repatriate his remains to the United States. His son, Joe Jr., and his now elderly mother, Anna, made the journey. It was a journey of profound, final closure. The remains of Captain Jarnot, a man who had left home with a promise of return, were finally coming home. His burial, a military service with full honors, was held in Arlington National Cemetery. The ceremony was a stark contrast to the quiet, unceremonious burial that had occurred in the Bavarian woods 50 years prior. It was a formal, somber affair, a final tribute to a man whose life had been lost to a terrible and secret accident. But even at the ceremony, surrounded by the solemn rituals of military honor, a new, unsettling detail emerged. As Joe Jr. stood beside his mother, watching the American flag fold over his father's casket, he was approached by a retired Air Force officer. The man, a veteran of the Cold War era, had been a part of the original investigation. He had read the official report, but he had also seen the unedited, classified documents, the ones that had never been intended for public eyes. The officer, with a heavy heart, shared a final, devastating detail with Joe Jr. The official report had been a sanitized version of the truth. It had been written to protect the reputation of the military and to shield the men who had been responsible for the test. The malfunction, the officer revealed, was not a simple accident. The test, he said, had been far more reckless than the public documents revealed. The booby trap was not simply a stationary device. It was mobile. It was, in fact, mounted on a remotely operated vehicle, a primitive drone, that was being piloted by a team of engineers and officers from the ground. They had been conducting the test in a high-traffic airspace, a risky and reckless choice that had been made in the interest of expediency. The malfunction, he explained, was a lie. The pilot, the officer confirmed, was not a random casualty. He was a test subject. The engineers had been attempting to see if they could tag a live target, a passing aircraft, with their experimental projectile. Captain Jarnot, a pilot with a pristine record and a predictable flight path, had been an ideal and unsuspecting target. The radio silence, the officer explained, had not been due to a sudden mechanical failure. It had been the sound of a man, a human being, in the final, panicked moments of his life, as he was struck by a projectile that defied all logic and expectation. The truth, now stripped of all its bureaucratic layers, was a final, devastating blow. It was not a tragic accident. It was a human experiment gone wrong. The story of Captain Joseph Jarnot was not just a case of a lost pilot. It was a testament to the dark, chilling reality of a Cold War era where human lives were considered expendable in the name of progress and secrecy. The discovery of the wreckage in the Bavarian woods was not a random act of fate. It was a final, desperate cry from the past, a cry that demanded to be heard. The forest, which had been so silent for so long, had finally spoken. It had given up its secret, and in doing so, it had exposed a terrible, brutal truth. The silence was broken, but the emotional wound it left was a deep and lasting one. The narrative was now complete, a terrible and profound journey from a mysterious disappearance to a documented act of injustice. And in the end, it was not the wilderness, but the hidden ambitions of men that had taken Captain Jarnot's life, leaving a trail of sorrow and a mystery that would haunt a family for half a century. The story of the vanished pilot was finally at an end, a truth unearthed from the depths of the earth, a truth that was as chilling and unforgiving as the Bavarian winter.